Hi everyone, that's our hype video for Philadelphia and for the Philadelphia Citizen to get you excited about civic engagement, and especially at this moment where we have a little bit of an election coming up. I'm Larry Platt, co-founder of the Philadelphia Citizen. And if you don't know us, we're a solutions-based media organization with an emphasis on defibrillating democracy in the American city where it was born. Get out those paddles. You know, we just had a mayor's race here where we had 19% voter turnout, I believe, in the birthplace of democracy. And that's just unacceptable. So what we're trying to do through solutions journalism, through thought leadership events like this one, and through nonpartisan calls for civic action, is to create a sort of army of citizens that fights the cynicism and takes back their city from the 200 or 300 insiders who have always benefited from owning it. So we want you to join the citizen movement. And any recurring donation, monthly or yearly, gets you free, discounted access to our events like this, and I'll tell you a bit about some more of those in a minute, and even a free tote. Did someone just say not another one?
You don't have to take it.
And you can pick up your tote in the lobby. Scan the QR code that's on the screen, or see Kristen right outside the ballroom doors after the program. She's in the corner there waving. To become a member, because we really want to sort of widen this militia into a full force army of civic warriors. Before we get started with tonight's great programming, some housekeeping. First, a big thank you to our partners, Campus Apartments, Dark Oak Capital, Head House Books, who is out there with the books, and of course, Fittler Club. This place is really one of the city's crown jewels, and if you haven't taken a tour or looked into membership, please do so. As for upcoming events, join us right here on September 17th for the launch of best-selling author and public intellectual Michael Eric Dyson's next book, Represent: The Unfinished Fight for the Vote. It's a dramatic exploration of democracy for young adults. Again, we think that civic engagement starts with voting. And like I said, we've got a lot of work to do in that area. But this is going to be a book event, but also a civic activism fair. We're going to have all sorts of options for young people and their parents to get engaged with in order to make them better citizens. And let's be real. All of you guys, and most of everyone who comes to citizen events, already vote. But that doesn't mean you can't be an evangelist for the vote to neighbors and relatives, and especially people who you disagree with. You know, I'm agnostic on who you vote for. And I think the Citizen is pro-vote, pro-turnout, pro-democracy. And then you have faith that if everyone exercises their franchise, we'll find the right way. Stay tuned to the Citizen website for the date of the next installment of our signature event series, The Ultimate Job Interview. We did an ultimate job interview for the mayoral primary, and we did a job interview for the Attorney General primary. And what these are is we bring in the candidates and we have them each individually interviewed by people who actually hire for a living. Because when you think about it, running for public office is a job interview. So we said, let's just extend the metaphor. So we had HR professionals, people like former Mayor Michael Nutter who have done the job before, and some journalists question candidates as if it were a job interview on qualifications, on values, on background. And we're looking to do that this fall with the U.S. Senate candidates, David McCormick and Bob Casey. And I believe Casey's already agreed, and we're trying to put pressure on McCormick right now. And finally, save the date for our signature Ideas We Should Steal Festival, presented by Comcast, NBC, Universal. It's November 14th, the evening here, followed by all day November 15th at the RJR Forum at the Comcast Technology Center. Go to thephiladelphiacitizen.org to get details and sign up. And now to our main event. We are so lucky to have Pulitzer Prize winner Eliza Griswold here tonight. And we're also fortunate beyond measure, I think, to be having her so brilliantly cover our Commonwealth in the pages of The New Yorker. She is, and I've written this, she is hands down the best political reporter covering Pennsylvania. And one of the best political reporters in the country, period. And we'll get to some of that in the Q&A. She's also the incoming Ferris Professor and Director of Journalism at Princeton University. And the Citizen and Princeton under Eliza will be collaborating on some really interesting academic work over the next year. I'll come back for the Q&A, but for now, here's Citizen editor Roxanne Patel-Shepelavi and Eliza Griswold in a conversation about Circle of Hope, a reckoning with love, power, and justice in an American church. Thank you all.
Thanks, Larry. Can you hear me? Great. Welcome. Welcome, Eliza.
Thank you.
So how many people here have already read Eliza's book? Okay, just a few. Great. So I don't know how Eliza feels about spoilers, but we'll try not to spoil the end. How many here know the end of the book? Oh, same people. Okay, all right.
A lot of people here lived the end of the book as I look around, so some are familiar.
So, let's get started. I'd love to have you just talk a little bit about what Circle of Hope was, how you came to it, and why it interested you.
Okay, so first, Roxanne, I just want to say thank you.
You're welcome.
It's really kind of you to be doing this, and we miss Kianga, who couldn't make it tonight because of some childcare stuff. And I also want to thank Corey and Larry and the Citizen just for doing this, because this is pretty amazing. And I'm not sure I've ever sat in a room before. I feel like we should be in a circle, maybe a drum circle. No. But because there's so many people whose point of views are hopefully reflected in these pages, named and unnamed, who are in this room right now. And I just want to honor that before even talking about it. So I came to the project because I really I was looking for a church that told a story of a very different kind of evangelicalism, one that was much more in keeping with the 17th and 18th centuries, with the founding of evangelicalism in America that has somehow been hijacked, that term evangelical, by the Christian right, really over the past 50 years. But at the edges of evangelicalism, there's a very different understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. And I've never really understood why the term Bible-believing or literal is owned by the right, whereas there's a much more progressive social justice-oriented movement rooted in the word and life of Jesus. So knowing that as an intellectual idea and speaking to kind of some of the leaders of that movement nationwide, I was looking for a church when I was writing about Shane Claiborne, who I think is down south this evening. I know he is. But I was writing about a leader of this movement, and he's here in Philadelphia, and he has an intentional community. And at that time, he's still doing it, he was melting guns into garden implements to beat swords into plowshares out of the Bible. And I was there standing by his mobile forge, by his intentional community, and there behind him on the street corner were modern Mennonite bearded, like, well, very chic, lots of tattoos, thrift store wearing crew who I could identify from a mile away was exactly the movement that I wanted to write about. So I asked Shane, hey, who are those guys? And he said, that's my church, that's Circle of Hope. And then I went to the Fishtown congregation, and met the pastor, and then met the 3 other current pastors at the time, and sat down with them and asked if I could follow them for coming years. And that's how it got started.
So this was early 2020?
No, 2019? 2019, end of the summer in 2019.
Okay, so, and you describe what they are. When you say that they are different than sort of traditional evangelical churches in America, in what way?
Well, first of all, they contest. I know even calling them evangelical is uncomfortable because a lot of them associate that term, as most Americans do, with conservatism. And lots of them, they're right here, left their childhood conservative megachurches, and there's an awesome podcast called Saved by the City, and this kind of represents this movement where kids from rural Pennsylvania and other places came to Philadelphia and were confronted with the realities of injustice as they were lived, and found their theology challenged, and found a new and more authentic way to really be, I think many wouldn't use the term Christian even, but to follow Jesus in a more authentic way, which meant casting off the Republican politics of their parents, but not leaving Jesus behind. And I think one of the things I certainly see in the mainstream media, for which I write, is this misunderstanding. We use terms like nuns or ex-evangelical, that people who have left this childhood expression or this conservative expression are no longer faithful. And I wanted to correct that misinterpretation, because I think, we're not looking at a monolith. We're looking at lots of, there were even Satan worshipers who were in this group.
Wait, I'm sorry, there were Satan worshipers in the group?
Yes, because Circle functioned as 4 congregations at the time I was present, but it also had a model of really that megachurches have as well, called cells, which is small groups, and they meet once a week, and this was the coolest idea. Some met in skate parks, bars. They could meet anywhere. They could be about anything, and you didn't have to be a Christian to join, and that was pretty amazing.
So I think the way you describe it is it's a group of people who were trying to live the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, can you give a couple of examples of what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount?
Sure. I mean, probably so the best term is probably radical evangelical. That's a term I prefer to evangelical left or progressive, because the idea is to return to the root. And the root of the devotion of one's life to Jesus comes from his principal moral teaching. The Sermon on the Mount, it's 2,500 words. And it is like a blueprint for how to be a human, right? And so it begins with the Beatitudes, which are kind of what I call like Christian koans. Like, they're gonna turn your head about, like, blessed be the needy. Like, what is this? How are the needy gonna inherit the earth? And I'm not gonna quote scripture right now, because I'm already on thin ice. I can feel it. But many of the calls that we associate with sort of the radical inversion of power, which is really what Jesus was about, and what the teachings people were living, are represented in the Sermon on the Mount.
So how hard is it to be Christians who are trying to live that way, as opposed to being part of this evangelical right, but especially if you are an evangelical Christian by upbringing?
I don't know, Roxanne. I think there might be people, because I'm not evangelical, right? And I'm not a churchgoer in a regular way. I got screamed at by an Episcopal priest today for misrepresenting the Episcopal Church, which I grew up in, which was interesting. It was like a Instagram screed. It was like, how dare you insult the Episcopal Church on Morning Joe, and you better come to my church. And I'm like, that is the problem. You know, if you're a pastor, maybe don't scold and scream at somebody and then ask them to come. Like, no, sorry, no. So, you know, I think it's an almost daily challenge for anyone to live a faith of any kind. I would say these days, but maybe any days, but confronted by the ills of the world in such living color, and given so many opportunities for practices of devotion that have nothing to do with belief. I think it's almost a constant, the way in which our attention is being literally commodified. I think belief is also being commodified. So I think it's a challenge.
So you alluded to this, and before we get to the rest of the book, tell us a little bit about your experience with the Episcopal Church.
Sure. So there are lots of sweet friends of my parents here tonight. At previous book events, I've actually asked people to raise their hands if they're friends of my parents, and so many people have in the room, it's embarrassing. But so I grew up in the Episcopal Church, which at that time, and in certainly many expressions, was pretty funky. I mean, I think people don't associate it with that, but like liturgical dance and like crop hunger walks and like lots of felt, you know. And, you know, I learned to read from the Bible. Like that would, because church was a game, and there was no idea that there was a punishing God, nor was there an idea, and this is probably most central, that being a Christian was any kind of superior tradition to being anything else. In fact, that would be anathema. That would be a mark that something was wrong with your faith. And I think what else, I didn't really realize it until the book came out and I've started talking about it, but my dad, who went on, he was a pastor, and then he was a bishop, and then he was what's called the presiding bishop. And, you know, he wore a lot of jewelry and dresses. Like, he wore a lot of gold stuff. And my friends would be like, yikes, that's a serious human. And yet he was the most playful, you know, doing yoga every morning at 5:30. And after I started working on this book, and I was telling him about Circle of Hope and baptizing people in inflatable birthing tubs, we were swimming one day, and we were talking about early church mothers and martyrs, and he was like, you know, I could just baptize you again. And I was like, no, because I know there was one lady who jumped into the water and baptized herself, and that's what so we had a very playful, meaningful conversation about Mary Magdalene, like my dad was a wonderful man, who came under a huge amount of fire and was actually excommunicated by the Catholic Church in part of the Episcopal Church when he was for consecrating the first open homosexual bishop, Gene Robinson in 2003. And Dad, as I often say, had to wear a bulletproof vest under his dresses, under his vestments, because it wasn't, and this was a time of like, you know, jihadis everywhere. And the idea wasn't that, you know, somebody of another faith would attack him. It was that somebody who believed in another strain of Christianity so vehemently would actually take his life. And that was like watching the culture wars come for Christianity. And I think I saw that early. And I was already starting to report on evangelicals back then, conservative evangelicals, because we saw them a lot around after 9/11. There was a lot of talk about Islam being wicked and evil. And Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, was kind of at the heart of that. So I was writing about Franklin Graham at this time. And I remember him saying, well, the Episcopal Church is debauched anyway. So, of course, the culture wars are going to come into conflict with life there, when in fact, the culture wars are coming for everyone. And I think that's partly what I witnessed and what the people who lived at Circle of Hope saw in much more vivid detail than I did.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. You know, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned to me that you went into this thinking you were going to write a book about a happy community of Jesus-loving people who really lived their beliefs on the street, and that it was going to be really a book about a joyful book, about a quirky subculture in America. and it turned into a really different book.
Yeah.
So, so tell us, like, what are some of the things you observed that shook the church?
Okay, so some of the things, so that is exactly right. And I think one of the things that's painful for people who, like the founders, for instance, who lived so much of the history of this book before I arrived, is that those funny, fantastic days of like dumpster diving dinner parties, or like I met the other night in Washington a former member of Circle of Hope who was an anarcho-primitivist, which meant he hadn't showered for a long time because like to shower was like capitalist and you were casting off empire, like just vegetable oil, trucks fueled by vegetable oil, really good
Is he
music.
smelly?
Stinko. I mean, like somebody who just got up and went to the bathroom who told me you could smell the church before you got up to there on Sunday nights, right? Like, so just a kind of wonderful, rich history of intentional communities sharing paychecks as common purses, really radical being and living. And what I saw was very different than that, because what I saw was a church in crisis and a church dealing with a founder leaving, the struggle over that, as well as the double crises of pandemic, and then the death of George Floyd. And so a church that had for decades done pretty great community work, reaching out and helping others, was called to look within and interrogate its own systems. And that was really excruciating work.
And so, again, I don't want to give away too much, but how catastrophic was it?
Again, many people could answer this. There were people who felt that Jesus called them to stay together, and to break apart would mean failing that call. And there were other people who believed that Jesus was inviting, and maybe the evolution of their community required splitting apart. And it was the tension between those 2 points of view that became so excruciating.
So a lot of the conversations, a lot of what you witnessed was tension over anti-racism, over, I guess, Black Lives Matters, over sort of how this community could respond to the things that were happening in the country. Can you give just a little snapshot of something?
I can, and one thing I've learned from them, and witnessing sort of their community agreements and how that went, is I just want to say to anybody, if this is too raw, please don't hesitate to get up and leave. I certainly won't take offense. I'm here afterwards. Like, don't feel you have to sit through something that's becoming too painful because you lived it and now you're hearing it talked about. Please feel free to get up at any time. It's not a problem. So I'm sorry, Roxanne, what was your question?
Give a little snapshot of some of the tensions that you were witnessing.
So early on, the first kind of tension that I witnessed was a decision whether to shut down to in-person worship or not when the pandemic shut the world down. And on one side, one of the pastors, Johnny Rashid, thought, we really need to close to in-person worship. And another of the pastors, Ben White, who understood that argument, also said, if you're allowed to go to Home Depot, you should be allowed to go to church. And as Anabaptists, we don't follow the world's strictures. We follow our own. And so what essential business was a live question inside the church, which was fascinating to witness. After that, really what happened once George Floyd was murdered, and this idea of what are we called to be as a church. Circle had a long practice of many different forms of what many felt was effective anti-racism work, marching, all different aspects. But there were people within the church who felt it's really not enough to show up and march one more time. We're called to make a statement. And over that idea of making a statement, really an argument ensued over what is the role of a church in regard to confronting racism in society.
Well, and not just any church, right? But a church that whose reason for being was to show up.
Its explicit reason for being was to be anti-racist, right? So there were people who very legitimately were like, what are we doing? These are what you call the Proverbs on your website, but you're not living them. And that was pretty accurate and pretty obvious. And the response to that indictment then became really incredible and incredibly painful to watch.
So you, at the time when you were watching this happen, I mean, did you recognize that this same kind of conversation and same kind of conflict was happening in institutions and organizations all over the country?
100%, because I was living in my own secular progressive versions of those, like in every publishing company, in every magazine, like all these questions over language and inclusion were being asked. And all of the idea, I mean, one of the things that was tragic was the way in which the church prided itself so much on being embodied, right? Like you showed up. And one of the things that really was part of the problem was that online, their worship was really painful to watch, right? Like, so what had been, like, it was just low, like, the idea they had rejected, which I thought was an admirable rejection of this kind of slick, mega church, smoke machines, and right? And they did nothing like that. They were incredibly homespun. But when you're homespun and you're forced online, that became challenging in itself to watch. So yeah, does that answer it a little bit?
Well,
Maybe
so
not, no.
so but the question I was asking was about
She politely reminds me.
how this reflects what was going on in the rest of the country.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I don't think there's anybody here tonight from my publishing company who I love and revere and I'm grateful to, should they watch a recording. But I could see from their faces, I don't really know what was going on inside the company, but like we would be on a Zoom and I would be like, I'm watching this, and they would just be like, I was like, oh, something's happening in this company that reflects what's happening in this church. Like a contest over leadership and who has the right to speak and who is included and on what terms. And, I mean, this was the Audubon Society. This was Time's Up. This was every single progressive institution. And I think that's one reason this was so interesting to me, because there have been so many stories of the rise and fall of conservative, Jerry Falwell-esque churches. But has the left really asked itself those same questions or looked as unflinchingly like at our communities and what happens within them?
Well, one of the things that really comes out in the book is people were very sensitive, and there was some blame and anger and sort of resentment and guilt and like all these really painful things that people also had to deal with while not being in the same space.
Yeah, and they didn't deal with it well. I mean, that was part of the problem. I think what I watched was, out of these authentic questions, I think if the people who were being asked to answer them, the founder, the people who'd been around for a long time, had been able to sit more openly, to even engage in those questions, not to say you're right, but to be like, okay, now what are you saying? But instead, there was a level of defensiveness and reaction that really led to the problem and showed it in real time.
Yeah, so it's interesting because reading the book, you delve really deeply into, especially the pastors and the founders' lives, but you do it in this beautifully non-judgmental way, and so. There's like all this compassion and understanding, and so they're sort of seeing each other at times as villains, and you didn't. And was that? I mean, did you find yourself being sort of swayed?
No, I mean, when the thing that was challenging was to watch them fight and to know how closely they were actually aligned. But once they got into this fighting stance, they would see the other as an enemy in a way that was excruciating. And it's unusual for me. I'm pretty used to doing this immersion work. I've done it for decades, you know? So I know what I'm doing. And there were moments, I would say, that I did overstep in this book, in some of these meetings that were so tense, where I would just be like, can you guys talk to each other? You know, like because I couldn't stand it, right? And there was another thing going on, a kind of level of politeness, but it wasn't politeness, it was a reserve, where people would have blunt, clear things that I knew they were thinking, because I knew what they had told me they were thinking, but confronted with one another, they would revert into an abstraction that was impossible in a conversation for people to understand what the conversation was really about. So it was like offense and counter-offense, half spoken, half heard, half understood, and that was like cyclical, and that was very painful.
Well, and you were observing, but understanding the subtext of everything people were saying.
Yeah, and I understood when people were showing up authentically, because I knew that, and I also understood when they were showing up tactically, where they already knew what they thought and they were provoking a reaction to kind of underscore more evidence for their argument, which is a very human thing to do, and something I do with my husband. Like, it's like, it's what you do, right? Like, I have a grievance, you know, he has not done the laundry, and I'm not gonna say, have you done the laundry? I'm gonna be like, I'm doing, you know, whatever. Like, it's passive aggression, you know? And it's easier sometimes than telling the truth. And that, it's just a human trait.
So tell me how you did this. So you know, you started in the fall of 2019. You're going to the different congregations. I mean, how did you continue actually doing the reporting on the book and immersing yourself once COVID hit? So
I started going to church events. They're not just, there's a fifth principal character in this book. So I met very early on. I met the four pastors, and then at one of their incredible funky loaves and fishes baptisms in a birthing tub, inflatable birthing tub. That's maybe my favorite thing. I met a wonderful young woman, and I knew from the start that she would be central to the book. And she's here, so her name is Bethany, and I sat down, we had Indian food early on, and what I could tell from the beginning was that her perspective, seeing these guys as kind of the same lovable weirdos that I did, but with a much more profound focus, because she knew them very well, could serve as both critique and empathy all at once. So that was like the fall of 2019 into early 2020, right? And then, so I was attending church events, getting to know people, and then the church shut down, and suddenly I found myself on Zoom because they were on Zoom for, like we're talking about, like 10 hours a day, right? A pastor's meeting could last for 6 hours. Oh my God. Right? Like, that's not gonna work out for anybody, you know? Maybe not 6. I'm like doing the math, maybe more like 4, but too much, too long.
Yeah.
And the idea of devotion, again, rendered disembodied, was toxic and taxing. And yet everybody was doing their very best, because imagine how we were all struggling to do our best, like with ridiculous new, like cleaning our groceries, right? Like, we did have no idea what was effective. Like, I remember like doing baby wipes on the Fresh Direct bags and being like, this is silly. But imagine if each day you were living with the idea of, am I living my life as the most gift I can to the universe, compounded by that? It was a lot of pressure. And I think one thing this book really I hope does, is show how much pressure we put pastors under in this day and age, because it's a role we don't think a lot about. But these guys were social workers. Many were already social workers, but they had to wear a lot of painful hats. I had one pastor read the book early on who was not related to the church and do the math on what they were being paid per hour, and it was something like 72 cents. So I think you talked about the sense of compassion in it. It was just like watching humans do their very, very best on the front lines of existence every day, even though it was flawed, because if somebody had been embedded in my life in 2019 and 2020, man, I would be regretting that. It would be hard.
Also boring, because you were sitting on a computer for a lot of time, just looking at other people's lives.
Yeah, I hope it would be boring. I hope that's how people recall me. And
So we're going to go to, I think Larry's like edging towards the stage.
Okay.
We're gonna take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have a lot of things to say. I'll let Larry start.
Yeah, so I'm going to walk around and just please raise your hand, and no long-winded speeches because we don't have 4 hours. And I also want to acknowledge, I think I saw Pastor City Councilman Nicholas O'Rourke here. What? Is that right? He had to leave. Okay.
Okay, he was here earlier.
But you just did a piece with in the New Yorker on the work. Can you tell us about that story?
Larry's not a churchgoer. Larry likes the political reporting. Yes, I did. I have long wanted to write about Nicholas O'Rourke, and he is an incredible Working Families Party independent city council person. I think he's one of 17. I think he's the minority whip, yeah. And I went out with him. He is really well positioned right now to take soft Trumper voters over into the Kamala Harris camp. And so he's registering young black men to vote. That's one thing. He's part of an effort to register 2024 young black men to vote, but he's also having incredibly open conversations that kind of function like deep canvassing, but in real time. And I had the huge privilege with Bethany of going to barbershop, I'm trying to remember what it was called, on Germantown Avenue. I want to say Brilliant, but that's not the right word of it. It's across from Zaz Ice Cream, and it's really, I'll remember the name in a second. But that's what we did. We hung out in barbershops, we talked to young people, we talked to city workers about voting, and he go out and follow him because he's a lot of fun. Or volunteer, and if you want to volunteer, possibly Bethany will take your name. Okay.
Well, and you said that there was a shift.
Yes.
That you kind of witnessed in real time, a shift happening.
I witnessed that shift in real time. Kamala had announced 2 days earlier, right? And it was pretty mind-bending, I do have to say. Like, listening seriously to why, I had just come from Butler County, right, covering the assassination attempt. I am no stranger to listening to the Trump voter, right? It was incredibly eye-opening to listen to black men who were going to vote for Trump, or had thought they were going to. And my favorite of those people was Nick's brother, who is a homesteader and a military veteran, and also has come out of military prison. And he was going to vote for Trump because Trump is a felon, and he said, despite the fact that Democrats care about mass incarceration, Trump can do more for former felons in one snap than those Democrats can do in forever. And Nick's brother wanted to run for sheriff in his county, and he thought his best shot for being able to do that was to vote for Trump to change the law. But he has rethought that position, and so he is one soft Trumper who has moved to another camp. So that was in real time. Maybe because the New Yorker called and really drilled down. Are you sure? Are you sure? Yeah.
Let's hear from the audience here. Right here.
I was wondering, was there a possibility for some sort of mediation in the context of a church? Somebody who could do the role that you couldn't do as an objective observer, somebody who could say, you guys are talking past each other, you all want the same things?
Well, they did call in one of the fights, or the disagreements really, was around the role of a DEI consultant. They hired an outside consultant who ended up quitting, and then that role was filled by a remarkable young woman in the church herself. And I will let you read the pages to see how that goes.
We have a question over here. On my horse. And say who you are, by the way.
Yes, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. My name's Casey Biename. I'm dipping my toes into qualitative research, and I was struck just from the very beginning of your text indicating how just being an observer impacts the system. And I was curious, were there ever concerns that you just being an observer in this church that had a base in exceptionalism might have exacerbated the system, and how you combated that?
Okay, I love your question. I'm a little bit confused by the use of exacerbated. Like, I made the fighting worse? Or no, the exceptionalism worse?
I was just curious of having like a reporter among people who wanted to all be right.
How that affected things.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant question. So one thing, because I teach journalism, and I think that we as journalists really need to interrogate, immersion journalism, which is what we sometimes call fly on a wall. Like, I show up and the way I describe it in the book and elsewhere is like, it's like somebody's driving the car of their life, and I knock on the window and say, can I get in the back of your car? And they say, sure, I'm gonna be in Boston in 3 hours. And then 7 years later, they're in Mexico with 3 flat tires, and they're like, what happened to my life? Did you do this? Right? So I'm used to following people to places they didn't expect to go, and neither did I, right? That's part of the work. What I think we need to do more honestly in journalism generally, but certainly in this immersion work, is to own the fact that our presence changes things by definition, right? It's quantum physics, but it's also just the reality that I often tell a story about the last book I wrote. This kind of gives you an example where the woman who I wrote about, Stacey Haney, who actually sent me a picture of reading the book today, which was very sweet, the new book, she was a hunter, and she had shot a deer with a crossbow and cooked the venison, and she was cutting it in her kitchen, and I surprised her, and she cut her finger. And I had to take her to MedExpress to get stitches, and she's a nurse, which meant she couldn't go to work for 3 days, right? So that's a kind of perfect example of how, that's what happens. I don't think, the integrity with which the pastors kept showing up was incredibly humbling to me. They had agreed to let me do this. None of us expected any of what happened to start to happen. And I'm thinking of Ben White. I'm thinking of the founder's son, who was a pastor at one point, when it became clear that either he was going to leave his role or he was going to get fired. And I said to him, Ben, if you do leave, are you going to let me follow you? And it would have been a perfect moment for him to say, F you and F this book, and to take it out on me. And he was like, I guess so, right? And I really was grateful, but I also, and I'm seeing that now. I'm in touch with each of them in a different way. And one said to me today, as we watch this book come into the world and begin conversations, actually it is what we'd hoped for. Because I had thought it would be happy, clappy, people being like, wow, I'm gonna sign up, where's my t-shirt? Instead, it's a much more profound investigation about where meaning lies. But I've been shocked by people's willingness to enter into that, almost a hunger for it, which doesn't surprise me in that I see that at the New Yorker. When I started to write about religion, I had to do some convincing to my editors that people really cared about religion, and yet the response to these articles has much less to do with how I'm writing them and much more to do with the subject matter. And I think that's what's happening with this book as well. But it's difficult. I mean, I will not begin to underestimate how difficult it is for private people to have something so painful where they don't look great, and they know that, to come into the world, a world they care so deeply about.
And we already met Bethany.
Hey, y'all. My name is Bethany. Eliza, first of all, thank you so much for the work that you did to track our church. Not a lot of people can say that one of the most intense moments of their lives have been documented by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. But this is a question that has consistently come up, and we even asked you this on the podcast. But I'm wondering, when you write a piece like this, when you spend 4 to 5 years walking with people, do you have an intention behind the story that you want to tell, or do you have an idea of an experience that you want your readers to have?
That's great. That's an incredible question. So I would like to do a couple of things. First, I would like to name check Color Correction Podcast, which is incredible and so funny and fantastic. Bethany is an incredible writer in her own right, and from the beginning, incredible writer. One of the questions has been, how can this book kind of help, not be extractive, how can this book help promote and get people where they want to be, right? So that's a live question. No, I don't. I wonder if I should think more about I don't think very much about a reader. When I think about, for this book, there was this idea of, I'm really tired of not only the Christian right, I'm also tired of the mainstream media writing about the Christian right. And I was like, if I write about this movement, I really do think it's going to help bring people to the movement, right? Because they're going to gather around this. And so that really, I was uncomfortable and clear from the start, where if people would explicitly, if the pastors were like, we think this might bring people to Jesus, I'm like, I don't know about that. That's not what I'm doing, and I want to be clear about that. But I think what you're doing is incredible. People should know about it. And I do think, although you guys don't care if people join your church, that was not explicitly it, that by shining some light on what authentically following Jesus can look like, that's pretty inspiring, because I myself found it very inspiring.
We have a question over here.
Okay. Don't be scared. Don't be scared.
Don't call me out, Charles.
I won't.
Come
I
for
won't.
you.
I'll be careful. So in days of yore, I'm standing on the steps of the National Cathedral after your father has just been made presiding bishop of the church. And your sister is there. And the two of you are saying to me, thank God that's over. I never would have imagined that you would be moving anywhere into religion. When you were in Chicago, when your father was a bishop.
Okay.
Okay. You were very proper, and you put on the white gloves and went to your church. To what extent was your father's own radicalism, which I think he was radical within the church, affected you in your own journey in journalism and writing?
That is a question I will find difficult to answer in real time, but I will do my best. So I never wore white gloves to church. I had to wear them to dancing class, which is its own sociological. Maybe that's my next book. People, I revered my dad, and I also had a lot of fun with him. And I think that there could be, I was thinking for a while that I might write a more personal book next, in part because one of the pastors said to me, how can you write snippets of my life? Where is yours? And that's one reason why I included my experience in the beginning, but that's why I wrote the end of the book as I did, because it's just honest, right? And I come from a tradition in journalism that is erase the first person, that's the highest ethical standard, is not to appear on the page. But again, I think it's time to interrogate that. And, I think someday I might have a more critical understanding of my dad. He died last year, and I'm still, in college, I took a course about individuation, right? And the stage, children go through a stage of emanation, the emanational bond, when they think their parents hung the moon. And And my sister may not feel the same way, but I am in that a little bit. And I also know that when people criticize him, I do not handle it well. Which again gives me a ton of empathy, because one of these 4 pastors, Ben, whose name I used before, his parents were the founder of the church. And when they were criticized, he did not know how to handle it. And it was impossible for me to not put myself in those shoes. So I don't know. That's kind of how I can answer it today, for now.
We have about 5 minutes left, probably time for 2 more questions, and there's one right here. Say who you are.
Joe Sengoba. Thank you for being here tonight. I was interested if the congregations and the pastors you spoke with and observed were thinking about the implications of this growing homeschool movement that's very tied with the evangelical right, and what the implications of that might be and how it got supercharged during COVID.
Well, one of the key characters in the book was homeschooled. She learned to read out of the King James Version of the Bible at her kitchen table with her fundamentalist preacher mom, and was like, Eve was made from the rib of Adam? That's not right. So yes, I think there was the experience of homeschool and its conservatism and its problematic nature in isolated pockets in the church of people who'd experienced it. But that was not their primary, not that many people had been homeschooled that I interviewed. But it was funny to watch those who did come to criticize that in a really interesting way.
All right, here's a question. Can you say who you are?
Hi, Eliza. My name's Dawn Smelser.
And Dawn Smelser.
Thank you so much for covering my words accurately. It was really vulnerable to speak with you because I felt very harmed by Circle of Hope. I didn't grow up in the church, so when I went to Circle of Hope, I thought I was signing up for a social justice movement.
Yeah.
And I found myself 8 years later in what felt like a high control group. And some of my friends and I, we talk about, some friends who also didn't grow up in the church say that, we found ourselves in something a little bit culty.
Yeah.
And when I read the book, I can't help but notice how each one of the pastors had an upbringing that was quite high control, from, the founders being part of the Jesus freaks and to, some of the more recent pastors, growing up like you just mentioned. And I wonder, what was your perspective in how that really disallowed them from seeing the patterns that they were repeating from their upbringing in the guise of just wanting to do good in the world?
That is such a profound question. And Dawn, your experience of, as we talked about it, as is in the book, of coming to the church and thinking you were coming to an African drum circle, right? Like the idea that the church was not transparent about what it was, that it was a church. And the idea that your yoga studio would come under criticism, and I don't want to say more than is in the book because I want to be respectful of that, was profound for me in writing the book, and you're incredible. I think that the reason that you spoke to me was because you had been harmed and a friend of yours had been even more harmed, and you didn't want that to go unnoticed, and you knew that friend needed somebody to stand up for her, for me to know that had happened, because it's one thing for somebody to say to me what's happened, and another for somebody to say, no, I watched that, right? So first of all, thank you, right, for being such a good friend and a profound person. What I think, and this is more controversial maybe than the high control piece, what I think will come, which I do not understand, is in the nature of evangelicalism itself. This idea of being that having a personal relationship with Jesus, that one is saved by that, and others are not, right? Now, people will give you a lot of talk about like, but we just love, I don't hate somebody who's not saved. And, you know, the founder said to me, you know, even a good Hindu meets Jesus in the end. Like, there's lots of language around this, but I think it's in the theology that is problematic, because there's a exceptionalism, there's a paternalism that still has to be investigated, whether progressive or not. And I have seen people, I got another letter from somebody who said, yeah, well, just be careful you're not redeeming things that are still need to be investigated here. And I think that that's a legitimate critique.
So we'll take one more.
Okay.
Great. Say who you are.
Hi, Suzanne B. Miller. So my question is around the political campaign that's happening right now. And what's been striking to me is the reclaiming of liberty, patriotism among the progressive movement that is our, the Democratic nominee. And I'm curious sort of how you feel about that and sort of the media's reaction to that, but also reclaiming religion and social justice in the name of religion as part of a political movement, and whether you see sort of progressives reclaiming that as well in sort of the tradition of Father Drinan, all that, sort of what's come before.
Totally.
So I'm curious how you see a larger reclaiming happening today.
I do think there's a larger reclaiming happening. I wrote about this in the New York Times in an op-ed last week about the Christian case against Trump, right? That there's a fed-upness, and it's been going on. It began in 2016, and then there was more of a movement in 2020. Arguably, that it was actually progressive evangelicals. I'm thinking of a man named Doug Padgett. There are two, in Michigan, there were two heavily evangelical counties that his work really flipped in Western Michigan in 2020, delivering Michigan to the Democrats. And so I think there is a reclaiming going on. I think it's like, I don't want to use the word adjacent, but it's like next door to what I'm writing about here, right? Because it's this idea of like, who in the hell, that Jesus is not Trump. Like, why are you guys talking about Cyrus, like the first Persian emperor of Houthi? What? Like, Jesus said, love your enemy, which Trump has openly rejected, right? He said, sorry, nobody can love your enemy in real time, right? Like, that's for somebody, I mean, he openly has rejected the Bible. So the idea that the iconography of Trump is so strange, and I think people are finally coalescing around that. In this piece in the Times, I write about Reverend, but it's actually Bishop William Barber, reinvigorating Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, right? Organizing around a living wage and universal health care. And there are 34 million low-income voters who are persuadable in this election. And many of them don't turn up to vote because they don't hear the issues they care about. So I think that when people often say to me, why are you writing about these evangelicals? They're such a small part of this larger whole, which overwhelmingly supports Trump. It's not the size of a movement, of its members, that matters necessarily. It's who they can affect. And I think this idea of a moral, muscular, visionary call is really, it inspires me, and I am nothing like them, right? So I think that's a really good question, and I do think that's happening.
Okay, I would just like to note that these were the best questions I think we've ever had from
They're
an
smart,
audience
these
ever.
Circle of Hopers.
Like, I should have just shut up and let you guys ask all the questions.
Agreed. Made the job really easy. So Eliza, thank you so much. Let's hear it for Eliza Griswold. What a thoughtful, brilliant writer. And now let's sign some books.
Nice. Thank you
Thank you
all
all.
for coming. And I will be back here on September 17th with my Little Princeton class, right, for this young person's engagement in voting.
Awesome.
And I'm excited about that. So
That's
I
great.
would say if you're an educator, if you've got young people, come on back.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Okay.